It's a miracle whispered by the wild. By the second week, Thomas realized something extraordinary was unfolding within the walls of his lonely home. The silence that had once pressed down on him like a heavy stone was now alive with the restless heartbeat of new life. The kittens, once fragile and blind, had become miracles in motion. Each evening, the quiet was broken by the sound of tiny claws skittering across the wooden floorboards, their playful growls and squeaks echoing like music through rooms that had known only grief. Thomas would lie awake in the darkness, listening as they tumbled and wrestled, their little bodies colliding in innocent joy. A reminder that even after loss, life finds a way to return. He followed the trail of paw prints one morning, delicate imprints dusted across unused rooms, and felt a strange warmth rise in his chest. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, he discovered the smallest one. The runt, the one he had feared might not survive, curled in sleep atop Margaret's favorite cushion. It was as if the kitten had chosen that sacred spot deliberately, laying claim to a memory, bridging the gap between what Thomas had lost and what he had unexpectedly been given. And in that moment, he whispered to himself words that felt both prayer and confession. The wilderness and the solitary place shall be glad for them, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. It's a cry from the soul of nature, one that will take you from silence to survival, from loneliness to a miracle that binds man and wild in a way the world will never forget. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom like the rose. Isaiah 35:1. That verse became the living heartbeat of what was about to unfold inside an old farmhouse, where walls once filled with laughter now trembled with the sound of claws, breathing, and a truth too wild to imagine. For Thomas, an old man who thought his heart had closed to miracles, the night began like any other. Quiet, heavy, familiar, until the wild itself knocked on his door in the most impossible way. And when it did, the bond between animal and humanity would forever carve itself into his spirit like fire into stone. This isn't just an animal rescue or a touching animal story. It's a viral YouTube story born from survival. A dramatic wildlife rescue where a human and a wild mother discovered that love has no species. Thomas had grown accustomed to silence, but not the kind of silence that heals. The kind that breaks you slowly, night after night. At 73, his weathered farmhouse stood like a lone sentinel on the edge of Arizona's Coconino National Forest, its wooden bones groaning with every desert wind, its windows staring blankly into the wild beyond. Since Margaret passed 5 years ago, the laughter of his 3 children had faded into memories, replaced only by phone calls that felt like echoes of a past life. God places the lonely in families. He sets the prisoners free and gives them joy. And yet, Thomas's family had been reduced to voices over crackling speakers, never filling the hollow rooms with the warmth of presence. The land around him was both gift and curse. 12 acres of ponderosa pine and high desert, where elk drifted through the meadows like shadows and coyotes sang beneath the stars. It should have been freedom, but for Thomas it was isolation. Until one spring night, when the silence cracked open, scratching beneath the kitchen floor, heavy breathing near the counter, shadows that seemed alive. He told himself it was mice, maybe pack rats. But deep down, the wilderness was already whispering something else. And in that whisper lived the beginning of a miracle. An emotional true story, a heartwarming animal video waiting to be born. The first true moment came when his daughter Emily, on a casual video call, saw what his own eyes had missed. "Behind you, Dad." Something just moved. He spun, heart hammering, catching only a flicker of fur disappearing into the kitchen's edge of light. It wasn't a rat. It wasn't small. It moved with fluid grace. A predator's rhythm, the kind of presence that didn't belong in human walls, yet felt as though it had been summoned there for a purpose greater than fear. Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. In that moment, Thomas didn't know he was entertaining an angel of the wild, a mother searching for sanctuary, bringing with her a story that would touch millions of hearts across the world. Fear wrestled with wonder inside him. Most would have panicked. But Thomas wasn't most. He had buried a wife, raised children in hardship, and stood alone against life's storms. So instead of fleeing, he grabbed his flashlight and walked toward the unknown, stepping into the rhythm of a viral YouTube story no camera could have scripted better. What he found would never leave him. Lowering himself to one knee, joints aching, he shone the beam beneath the counter where Margaret's old soup pots once rested. And there she was, a wild bobcat. Her tawny fur was damp with sweat, her flanks heaving with contractions, golden eyes blazing with both pain and defiance. Around her she had woven a crude nest from dish towels, old newspapers, and even insulation from the walls. And beside her lay two tiny, trembling kittens, their eyes sealed shut, mewling into existence. Thomas froze. The wilderness itself had chosen his home as its birthing ground. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. The verse seemed to echo in the tiny cries of the kittens, in the raw power of a mother pushing new life into the world within the walls of a lonely man's kitchen. And in that moment, Thomas wasn't just a bystander. He was witness to a miracle, a soul-lifting, heartwarming animal video unfolding before his eyes, destined to become one of the most emotional true stories the internet would ever share. He could have called for help. He could have chased her out, or panicked, or barricaded himself away. But instead, Thomas did the one thing that marked this as a survival story worth telling. He stayed, quietly, reverently he stayed. His flashlight beam softened. His breathing matched hers, and in the dim golden light of the farmhouse, a wild bobcat mother gave birth while a grieving widower found something he thought he had lost forever. Purpose. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and a little child shall lead them. The verse was alive in that kitchen, where predator and human didn't clash but coexisted, where fear gave way to reverence. Hours passed, each contraction another thread weaving Thomas into her story. And when the final kitten slipped into the world, weak but alive, Thomas felt tears sting his eyes. It wasn't just an animal miracle. It was a wild bond, a dramatic wildlife rescue written by the hand of creation itself. From that night forward, the farmhouse was no longer silent. Tiny cries filled the kitchen, golden eyes watched from the shadows, and Thomas found himself waking each morning with something to protect, something to believe in again. His children worried, of course, but when he sent them photos of the kittens, small and helpless in their mother's care, even they were stunned into awe. What began as fear had transformed into a touching animal story that spoke to the very core of humanity. That even in the wildest, rawest moments, love chooses sanctuary. And the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. The peace that had eluded Thomas for 5 long years returned in the most unexpected way. Through a wild bond, through the miracle of birth, through the trust of an animal that should have fled, but instead stayed. And as weeks turned into months, the bobcat and her kittens grew strong, then finally returned to the forest, leaving the old farmhouse empty once again. But not silent, for silence had been replaced by memory, by miracle, by the echo of tiny cries that healed a human heart. And so, the story ended not with loss, but with life. Thomas, the man who thought his days of love were over, had discovered that the wilderness still had the power to change his heart. The bobcat mother, desperate and alone, had found sanctuary in the most unlikely place. She must have been in deep distress to take such a risk. Perhaps she'd been pushed from her territory by the endless crawl of human development. Maybe she was a young mother, trembling on the edge of inexperience. Yet here she was, in the heart of his grief-filled home, laying her life and her baby's lives before him. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. The verse rang in Thomas's chest as he stared into her golden eyes, realizing that both of them, human and beast, were broken, frightened, and in need of something greater than fear. For a long moment, logic screamed at him. He should call Arizona Game and Fish. This was dangerous, reckless, even life-threatening. A wild predator in his kitchen. She could strike if she sensed her kittens were in danger. She could be diseased, Every rational voice told him to back away, pick up the phone, and let professionals deal with this. But reason was drowned out by something deeper, something older. The primal recognition that her eyes weren't filled with aggression, but with terror. She was a mother caught in the rawest act of survival. And in her gaze, Thomas saw a mirror of his own grief. The helplessness of someone who had once lost everything and had no choice but to cling to life anyway. Another contraction seized her, her pink tongue lolling as she panted heavily, her body trembling with the effort. "Easy, Mama," Thomas whispered, voice breaking into the silence. "Easy now. I'm not going to hurt you." His words, soft as prayer, floated into the dim light, and whether she understood or whether exhaustion simply dulled her defenses, her growl softened, shifting from menace to fatigue. With deliberate care, Thomas reached for an old flannel blanket. Margaret's blanket, the one she had stitched by hand years ago. Using the broom handle, he gently pushed it toward her crude nest. In that quiet, fragile moment, a human heart and a wild mother formed a pact of trust no one else would ever believe. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and a little child shall lead them. Yet here it wasn't a child, but an old man, and it wasn't a lamb, but a wild bobcat. Proof that creation itself was bending its laws to weave a miracle inside his kitchen. 2 hours passed like an eternity. Thomas sat on the cold floor with his back against the refrigerator. Flashlight tilted upward to cast a soft glow over the scene. He watched her body quake with contractions, each guttural groan breaking into the silence. Each new cry announcing the arrival of fragile life. One by one, kittens emerged, wet, trembling, blind, utterly helpless. He watched her lick them clean, rough tongue coaxing breath into their lungs, stimulating their tiny bodies until they squirmed and whimpered like fragile instruments testing their first notes. By the time the 5th kitten arrived, smaller, weaker, its cry faint, the first strokes of dawn filtered through the kitchen window. The sight was almost unbearable in its beauty. This wasn't just biology. This wasn't just instinct. This was devotion, sacrifice, creation itself laying bare the sacred bond between mother and child. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And Thomas wept, not the silent, controlled tears of a man who has learned to bury his grief, but the full, trembling sobs of someone who had not cried since Margaret's funeral. In the fragile cries of those kittens and the low, rumbling purr of their mother, he heard the return of life to a house long defined by silence. When dawn fully claimed the sky, Thomas forced himself to stand, his knees stiff and aching from hours on the hard tile. He knew the rational path. Call the authorities, have the bobcat removed, protect himself. Yet, as he looked at the exhausted mother curled around her tiny family, her sides still heaving, her golden eyes watching him with exhausted trust, he knew he couldn't. Not yet. She had chosen him, or perhaps God had chosen both of them for each other. Instead of dialing game and fish, Thomas dialed Sarah. Her gasp of disbelief crackled through the line. Dad, you're joking. A bobcat, in your kitchen, with babies. 5 of them. Thomas replied, sending her a photo with trembling hands. Within an hour, the family conference call was in full swing. Michael, practical as ever, demanded he call authorities immediately. Emily, torn between veterinary fascination and concern, warned of the dangers of abandonment or aggression. But Sarah, his firstborn, his steady rock, asked the only question that mattered. What do you want to do, Dad? And Thomas, staring through the doorway at the miracle nestled under Margaret's blanket, answered with the conviction of a man whose soul had just been reborn. I want to give her a chance. Just a few days. Let her recover. Let the kittens grow stronger. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. And in that verse, in that decision, a pact was sealed not just between man and wild, but between a grieving soul and the God who still worked miracles in kitchens. What followed was the most extraordinary week of Thomas's life, a week that blurred the line between survival and sanctuary, between loneliness and connection. Each dawn, before Sage, the name he gave her for her wise, patient eyes, stirred. Thomas placed a plate of raw chicken or rabbit meat by the den. He filled a water bowl, then retreated to the living room, giving her space. She learned his routine, tensing when he entered, but no longer growling if he moved slowly. Once, when a kitten crawled too far, Sage looked straight at Thomas, her gaze steady, trusting him not to harm the tiny creature while she retrieved it. It was communication deeper than words, proof of a wild bond forged in silence. From his recliner, Thomas filmed the kittens, their eyes cracking open by day 5, their tiny paws kneading against their mother's belly. His phone became a portal to wonder, each photo and video sent to his children and grandchildren like chapters of a living fairy tale. What began as fear became awe. What began as isolation became a heartwarming animal video shared in laughter and tears. And for Thomas, who had thought his heart had turned to stone, every mewl, every rumbling purr, every trusting glance from Sage reminded him of one truth. Life still had the power to surprise him, to heal him, to call him back from silence, the righteous care for the needs of their animals. And in caring for her, he found himself cared for in return. When the week passed, Thomas didn't call authorities. By then, Sage had grown stronger, her kittens more alert, and one morning, as though she knew the time had come, she gathered them gently in her mouth, one by one, and disappeared into the forest's embrace. The kitchen was empty again, but not silent. The echoes of life remained. The tiny cries, the rumbling purr, the miracle of trust that had filled his home. Standing at the doorway, Thomas whispered into the wind, "Thank you." Because in saving her chance at survival, she had saved him from despair. This wasn't just an animal rescue, wasn't just a dramatic wildlife rescue. It was a touching animal story, a viral YouTube story born from the bond between man and wild. And as he turned back into his farmhouse, he knew with unshakable certainty that he was no longer alone. The wilderness had changed his heart forever. By the second week, the fragile miracle inside Thomas's quiet Arizona home had begun to grow restless, alive, unstoppable. What had once been tiny blind kittens pressed helplessly against their mother's fur had transformed into a flurry of life that refused to be silenced. At night, Thomas could no longer escape their presence, their tumbling paws. Thomas sat in his recliner that evening, his breath heavy with dread, and watched as Sage, with silent grace, began moving her kittens one by one to a new spot. Behind the washing machine in the laundry room, it was instinct. In the wild, Bobcat mothers moved dens often, always one step ahead of predators and parasites. Her golden eyes met his for a long, eternal moment as she carried her child past him, dangling gently from her mouth. And in that gaze, he saw her truth. "You know I must go." And he whispered, voice breaking, "You know you have to go, don't you?" The verse of his life burned through him. Even the sparrow finds a home, and the swallow builds her nest near your altar, O Lord of hosts. Thomas knew her wild altar was calling. His heart cracked open. The next morning, Thomas awoke with resolve, carrying in his chest the heavy understanding that love sometimes means letting go. He opened every door of his home, front, back, even the garage, as though preparing the house itself to breathe out the family it had sheltered. He laid a trail of meat from the laundry room to the back door, leading them toward the forest's edge where freedom waited. Then he retreated to his bedroom, as though stepping out of the story to allow nature to reclaim its pages. He drifted into uneasy sleep until his phone buzzed, Emily's voice trembling with hope. "Dad, did you see them leave?" He rushed to the window, and there they were. Sage at the tree line, bathed in the red glow of the setting sun, her 4 kittens tumbling in wild joy around her paws, his chest filled with both pride and sorrow. But then it shattered when he counted again. 4. There were only 4. The runt was gone. Missing. He found it still inside, its small body trembling, its cry weak but piercing. Whether it had been too tired, too slow, or overlooked in the frenzy, Thomas would never know. But the truth was clear. Sage had left it. Nature does not bend for sentiment. In its harsh arithmetic, the weak are sometimes left behind so the strong can endure. The reality struck Thomas like a blade. He placed the crying kitten in a box near the forest edge, praying Sage would hear, praying she would return. But through the night, the cries echoed unanswered, and by dawn, the sound had grown faint, fading into exhaustion. Thomas stood trembling as he whispered to the fragile creature, his voice carrying the verse he clung to like a lifeline. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? Yet not one of them is forgotten by God. He knew now, if Sage did not return, he must step fully into the story. With a heavy heart, he dialed the number he had avoided for weeks. Help was coming. And with it, both hope and the terror of goodbye. When the officers arrived, Thomas expected judgment, but instead, he found compassion woven into their professionalism. Officer Janet Rodriguez, her eyes seasoned by 20 years of wilderness work, listened with rapt attention as Thomas poured out the story of Sage and her kittens. She bent over the fragile runt with reverence, her voice soft as she said, "Mr. Hargrove, what you've witnessed is extraordinary. Bobcats are elusive. For one to give birth inside a human home, and for her kittens to survive this long, I've never heard of such a thing." Her partner, young Officer David Park, was already at work, scanning tracks, setting equipment, measuring every possibility of reunion. The kitten was dehydrated but clinging to life. Time was thin as breath. They traced Sage's new den to a hollow beneath a fallen ponderosa pine 300 yards from Thomas's property. There they set the reunion box, a crate designed for the sacred handoff between wild mother and human hope. They placed the runt inside, its tiny cries breaking against the silence of the woods, then retreated. From their parked vehicle, Thomas watched through the trail camera feed, his hands trembling against the glass, his knuckles white from gripping his knees. Rodriguez's voice carried both warning and prayer. Mothers sometimes reject their young if too much time has passed, but bobcats, they are good mothers if they hear the cry. 3 hours passed like 3 lifetimes. The sun rose higher. Birds sang their songs of indifference, while Thomas's soul burned. And then movement. Sage emerged, her body low, cautious, every step a hymn of survival. The kitten's cries pierced the air, sharper, louder, desperate. Sage circled, wary, testing the human-scented air, but drawn by the eternal bond. And then, with one swift motion, she reached into the box and lifted her child into her mouth. But she did not vanish immediately into the forest. Instead, she turned toward Thomas's house, her golden eyes locking with the place she had once dared to call sanctuary. For a moment, the wild and the human world touched through her gaze, and Officer Rodriguez whispered, "She's looking for you. I think she's saying goodbye." Thomas pressed his palm to the window, tears falling unchecked, whispering through the verse that rose unbidden. "The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat." The wild was not the enemy, it was kin. With her child safe in her mouth, Sage melted back into the forest shadows, leaving Thomas's heart aching but whole. The days that followed carried both emptiness and fullness. Like waves colliding in Thomas's heart, his home was silent once more. But it was no longer the silence of grief. It was the silence of something sacred having passed through. He cleaned the kitchen, folded Margaret's blanket, and found himself standing often on the porch, staring at the forest's edge. And then, miracles layered upon miracles. Through binoculars, he sometimes glimpsed them. Sage teaching her young to hunt, stalking through the tall grass with patient elegance. All 5 were alive, the runt bounding alongside its siblings, strong and whole. His heart lifted each time, as if resurrected. Months later, one evening at dusk, a smaller bobcat appeared at the edge of the trees watching him. Its chest bore a distinctive white patch. The runt